Um, I'm going to talk today in quite a general way because this is a huge topic relevant to all of us, but I hope what I say will be relevant to the particular situation both in India and in the other 17 countries where some of you come from on this call. And I'll be very much looking forward to your questions. What I want to do is to start out from some very general context about COVID-19. I'm not a scientist. I'm a citizen. So I'm affected like everyone else by this huge global crisis. And I need to know as a person more about what this crisis means. And some important journalism has helped me become aware of the bigger pattern that underlies the COVID-19 crisis. And here's an article that particularly struck me from John Vidal, one of the world's most famous environmental correspondents, writing for The Guardian just about a month ago, where he relates the crisis of COVID-19, which is affecting all of us so vividly at the moment, to a much bigger problem, which is that it's actually humanity's destruction of biodiversity that is creating the conditions for new viruses and diseases such as COVID-19. And he quotes a number of scientists in the article, including David Quammen from New York, who writes that we cut the trees, we kill the animals or cage them, send them to the markets, we disrupt ecosystems, we shake the viruses loose from their natural hosts. And when that happens, those viruses need a new host. And often we human beings are it. That's a striking and very sobering thought. And he goes on to quote another scientist who deals with the other side of this problem, which is the problem of how once the virus enters a human being, it then spreads between us because of our habits of travel. He quotes Byron Bird from California, who writes that we're in an era now of chronic emergency. Diseases are more likely to travel further and faster than before, which means that we must be faster in our responses. It needs investment, change in human behavior, and it means we must listen to people at community levels. We can't predict where the next pandemic will come from. The only certain thing is that the next one will certainly come. So the COVID-19 crisis, vast though it is just part of a much bigger possibility of long-term repeating crises linked to the global nature of the economy, the global nature of human interaction, travel, and so on. So how should we think as citizens all around the world about the challenge for humanity that this crisis raises? Well, there are actually many levels of crisis, as we all know. There is, of course, the global health crisis, or is it, as John Vidal suggests, an unfolding series of crises? Then there is the resulting global economic crisis caused by the consequences of governments' public health policy reaction to the public health risk. But this global economic crisis is having very uneven effects on human beings, resulting in a new social crisis as well, an economic and a social crisis. At the same time, these crises are an opportunity for politicians of various sorts, authoritarians who want to impose more and more surveillance on us as citizens through apps for contact tracing and other devices, or politicians who want to impose their own sectional politics, such as President Trump in the United States, as he did at the beginning, calling this the Chinese virus. At the same time, for those very same politicians, there's a new type of crisis, which is a reality crisis, because they, even though they began by denying the truth of coronavirus, Bolsonaro, Trump, and others in other countries, they have had to face its reality. As Bill McKibben, the great environmental campaigner, put it, reality is capable of biting back and biting hard. So that's the multi-level crisis that we're all facing today. It's complicated. Surely, therefore, we must agree we need reliable public information to understand it, to even begin to confront it. So we go back to a cliche from 100 years ago from one of the first pieces of writing about the sociology of journalism from the American sociologist Robert Park, who wrote that reading, which was a luxury in the country, has become a necessity in the city. How much more it is a necessity today in an interconnected world. So that general point is obvious. We need information. We need good information. But that's very different from saying and explaining what is the rationale now for journalism as an institution. It's an especially tough question now at a time when older models of journalism are, as many of you know, already under threat. You're students of journalism, you're practitioners of journalism, but let me just for a moment run through what you know all too well about the nature of this threat to journalism that we so need today. There's an immediate threat to the economic models of journalism which will produce the news that we need. There is, of course, the short-term collapse in demand for advertising all over the world caused by the global economic crisis that I just mentioned. But this comes on top of a much longer-term crisis, a long-term reduction in consumers' willingness to pay for news, to pay for newspapers, to pay to go behind the paywalls on news websites. And that economic issue, that reduction in willingness to pay for news, is linked to a much deeper undertrend, which is the weakening of advertisers' interest in cross-subsidizing specific media content in the way that they've done for a century or more. As a marketing executive interviewed by Joseph Thoreau a decade ago put it, marketers never wanted to underwrite the content industry. They were just forced because they had no other way of reaching their consumers. But now they do, of course. Now they're not interested in mass audiences so much. They're much more interested in targeting their ads at individuals who they can track very precisely because of the data they're capturing from them all the time as each of us moves around online. And that's making possible a totally new principle of advertising, very different from the mass advertising of the past, which is the principle of deep personalization, summed up in that phrase from an industry newsletter from 7 years ago. How do you show users only the things that are relevant to them and hide those that aren't? And how do you modulate that in real time? That's what advertisers want now. And it's a logic that is profoundly worrying for all commercially funded journalism everywhere in the world. So to sum up the problems which journalism faces everywhere today, there are three converging problems. The first is, and this in a sense is good, it's an opportunity, is what can journalism be now? There are so many diverse media through which journalism can be presented on so many different scales, which is in many ways great and exciting. But there is an uncertainty about which type of journalism is most effective right now. But there's then the fundamental question I've just been mentioning is who will pay to make journalism still possible? What subsidies will make it possible? And then there's the third question on which I want to focus on in my talk today, which is looking ahead to the development of society and asking, what are the dangers? What are the problems that all of us can foresee wherever we are in the world if societies no longer have independent institutions whose main goal, whose intrinsic purpose is to provide common flows of information? In other words, the institutions that for a century, for 2 centuries, we've called journalism. I'm going to focus on that third question. And there's a reason for that, which is that if we can't answer that third question as to why humanity, wherever it is, needs something like journalism for the future, for us to be safe, then no one will ever have an incentive to answer the first 2 questions. So let's focus on that third question. What are the dangers? What are the problems if, looking ahead, societies no longer have an independent institution whose intrinsic purpose is to provide common flows of information, what we call journalism? And let's just think about the moment how I've emphasized, where I put the emphasis in that question. And sorry, by the way, if you can hear rain coming through, I hope you can't, but I'm talking from Britain, where of course it's always raining, and it is raining right now as I speak. So I hope it doesn't disturb your listening. But that's the question we want to focus on. And I'm emphasizing there the term society and the word independence. Why do I put that emphasis? Well, it's because, and this is maybe a frightening development, in the past month or two, some people are saying that it's authoritarian states, such as China, that are much better placed than liberal democracies to address a major public health crisis like COVID-19. That was the argument of Korean philosopher, now living in Germany, Byung-Chul Han, a month ago in the Spanish newspaper El País. And this argument is based on saying that the whole infrastructure of democracies, including a free press, may not even be helpful anymore to address a massive public health crisis like this. What Han asks, if the infrastructure of authoritarian societies, without any strong institutions of the free press, of course, is actually better, is actually more effective in addressing major public health crises. If that's right, then that surely has implications for how we think about societies in the future and how we think about the possible role of journalism within the future of societies. Every society today is battling with the COVID-19 crisis in view of the rest of the world. And of course, journalism is part of the reason for that. It's because a lot of the world does have free press. And it's because governments, even if they're not democracies, care about their reputation, care about soft power in geopolitical battles that are to come, that we are seeing what is going on in other societies and comparing what's happening where we are with what's going on elsewhere. And those global comparisons change how we think about the arguments for journalism in the future, the public rationale for journalism. And I think that means that the core question to ask today is not what democracies need from information from journalists, but what all human societies, wherever they are, whether or not their democracies need. The key question is not whether societies need some flow of information from somewhere. Of course they do. You can't fight a global pandemic without some accurate information. But the question is whether, and if so, why, those information flows must be independent from the state, as journalism in the traditional model has been independent from the state. Those are the core questions, I think. But if they're the core questions, then maybe it's a problem, as Barbie Zellitzer pointed out a few years ago, that all our arguments for journalism that we've inherited from previous centuries are about democracy as the reference point. But there are many societies in the world that are not democracies, and they just as much need journalism today as those which are. So maybe, and I agree with Barbie Zellitzer here, maybe in thinking about why we need journalism, we have to start from somewhere else. And that's why in my attempt today for you to think again about why now in the COVID-19 crisis we need journalism. I don't want to start from the standard liberal theories of why democracy needs a free press. I want to start from somewhere else. I want to start from a theorist who I think is particularly appropriate as we think about the case of India, and Ashish already mentioned him in his introduction, which is the thought of the great economist and philosopher Amartya Sen from India, but based for the past few decades in Harvard, United States. His work is really fascinating because what he's done for decades is recontextualize economic goals within wider ethical aims. He goes back to the beginnings of economics and argues that economics was always from the beginning part of moral philosophy. It just forgot its origins 2 centuries ago, and now it needs to reconnect with them. And he develops a fascinating argument in many books, particularly the book Development is Freedom from 1999, that human development actually isn't possible. It requires freedom. Freedom on 2 levels. Freedom involving fulfilling individual human needs, and freedom at a societal level involving the adequate flow of information through and across society back to government. Now, I know that the term development is controversial. I know in many ways it's a problematic term, and being a white Englishman, my forebears are part of the problems with the word development. It's because of the legacy of colonialism, especially British colonialism, that formed and shaped the path of so-called development in India and many other places. But Sen, coming from India, is a thinker who is contesting, who's trying to rethink development in new ways. So I just suggest it's still worth listening to him on this topic. And what does he have to say? Well, he argues there are a number of levels on which freedom is important to development. First of all, starting with personal freedoms, the freedoms of you or I as an individual. Our freedom, the freedom of each of us to speak, to be heard, as he puts it, an instrumental role in enhancing the hearing that people get in expressing and supporting their claims to political attention, including the claims of economic needs. So, as we know in India, when the lockdown was proposed, many pointed out that migrant workers were going to be massively disadvantaged by those general rules. Their economic needs urgently needed to be heard by the government. And of course, journalism and those people's own freedom of speech was crucial in making that possible. And that brings us to the second point, that as Sen points out, it's not just about you or me speaking, but it's about how society as a whole starts to rethink, to reconceptualize what are economic needs, who needs what, who's likely to need what. That's only possible if people can speak freely. Because, as he says, people do not typically get what they do not demand. In other words, society needs to hear what people say, to hear what they think in relation to their understanding of what people in general need if they are to live adequate lives. That's just the personal level where freedom makes a difference to development. But there's also the level of institutions, including the free press. And here, Sen's famous example is the question of famines. He writes in his book that the process of preventing famines and other crises, and he includes here epidemics such as COVID-19, this process of preventing these terrible things is significantly helped by the use of freedoms such as the opportunity for open discussion, public scrutiny, elections, and uncensored media. And his classic example of a case where the absence of institutional freedom made famine happen was China. China's massive and devastating famines between 1958 and 1961, where Sen argues it was the lack of a free system of news distribution that misled the government itself, which was fed by its own propaganda and by rosy reports of local party officials. Sen even quotes Chairman Mao, who actually defended the importance of democracy for government in China and said that without democracy, you, the government, have no understanding of what is happening down below. It will be impossible to achieve unity of understanding and unity of action. Now, the case of China today in relation to democracy, in relation to digital and social media platforms, in relation to the role of government in surveilling those platforms, is obviously very ambiguous, very ambivalent, as is the case of many other countries, such as the United States. But I think what Sen's approach brings out is that if we broaden our frame to development, human development as a whole, we get a much clearer idea as to why freedom, and journalism in particular, is absolutely essential to human life. That enables us then to reinterpret the old theories we've learned from the past about why we need a free press, why we need journalism, in terms of this wider value of development. In terms, for example, of the idea that humanity needs knowledge to spread. As Thomas Paine puts it over 200 years ago, we need a representative system with a free press to diffuse knowledge throughout the nation on what has to be governed, to explode ignorance and so on, because rule, government, requires an assemblage of factual information that no individual can possess. Milton, a century or more before that, had said that the streaming fountain of truth will be turned to a muddy pool of conformity and tradition if freedom of speech is constrained. And we can't afford public knowledge to be just about conformity and tradition when it's the safety of humanity. It's the facts of what is or is not safe for us that is at stake. And at a time, particularly as in a public health crisis, when, as Thomas Hobbes in the mid-17th century put it, we have to avoid the danger of falling into the confusion of a disunited multitude. Now, this might sound like just a defense of having free journalists, and of course it is that, but that's not enough, because just as the COVID-19 crisis is very complex, so the journalism, the journalistic institutions we need are complicated too. Here we need to draw on some other theorists who are much closer to communication science, such as the legal theorist from America, Ed Baker, who wrote 20 years ago that complex democracy requires both segmented media and general media. In other words, it means the general news media that support the search for societal agreement on our common goods, and segmented media that speak for particular interests, that let particular voices come through. Or as a French theorist, Pierre Rosanvallon put it, a French political theorist, democracies need discourses for commonality that make our social life legible and visible. We need to see what is going on in our societies, and also create a symbolic territory of shared trials, parallel histories. And I think in Britain and many other places, journalism certainly is doing this right now. It is sharing knowledge of how other people are coping with the very same crisis that each of us is coping with. So those are some theories who I think are useful. And I want to offer you a model for 4 basic ways in which media institutions are essential for humanity today, for human development. The first is very familiar, the providing of information resources. For elites, of course, for governments, as we've seen, but also for the general population, for all of us, ever more essential at a time of crisis. But that's not enough, because at the same time, journalists must not just present the facts, official facts, their interpretation of the facts, but witness different perspectives on the facts, recognize the diversity of life. And if they do those first 2 things, that will sometimes mean that they have to speak truth to power. They must correct governments when they get the facts wrong, when they don't listen to the facts, or when they ignore the suffering of particular parts of a population. And that also means that very often journalists have to speak with civil society to argue for redressing injustice. Those are 4 levels, I think, which are essential for journalism to contribute to human development today. But the thing I want to stress is that this very simple model of journalism doesn't depend on a theory of democracy. It doesn't depend on any idea of the sovereignty of the people, which was the classic theory of democracy and journalism from Tocqueville in the 19th century. Instead, it depends on a broader value, which is the optimizing of human beings' chances, as Amartya Sen put it, to fulfill our capabilities to have a wider quality of life. In other words, at the most basic level, in the face of a global health crisis, to maximize our chances of survival, of having any chance of a good life in the future. So I think the COVID-19 crisis forces us to clarify journalism's public rationale. Even so, though, there are some really special challenges which journalism, along with every other institution, faces today in the COVID-19 crisis. Let's just run through a few of those. There's an overwhelming need for governments to act rationally in response to the actual facts, not fantasy, of the crisis. So journalism must present facts. Journalists must question when governments don't seem to be acting rationally. At the same time, the economic crisis that is the result of public health measures is creating a social crisis, very uneven impacts. And that means that it's essential for journalists to reflect the diversity of experience, to witness what is going on across society. I also said there's a danger that governments and communities will use this health emergency to discriminate against particular groups. And that makes it even more important that journalism is involved in reflecting the diversity of experience and reporting actual injustice as it is happening. In other words, every level in that model of what journalism needs is essential for journalism to fulfill its role in human development today. It's not just a matter of giving the facts, presenting a so-called objective presentation, perhaps one that relies particularly on what the government of the day says. All levels are essential, especially because in a crisis, when the facts are deeply contested, deeply controversial, those facts can easily be mixed with short-term political advantage and political spin, which makes it even more important for journalism to present diverse perspectives that put the facts to the test. Diverse perspectives that reflect different regions, different classes, genders, ethnicities, different professional roles, the views of nurses, not just as businessmen, the views of migrant workers, not just of company owners. And this in turn requires a solidarity, not just in society, we're talking a lot about that today, but between journalists, between national journalists and local media journalists, between mainstream journalists working for large-scale broadcasters and small community media, who may provide an essential perspective on the diversity of experience in a major national crisis. And then there is a specific challenge of the COVID-19 crisis, which journalists have a special role in facing, a specific justice challenge, which comes because how societies respond to this crisis reflects their underlying political logics. This point was made a month ago, again in El País, by a Spanish writer who said that, tell me how your community constructs its political sovereignty. Tell me, in other words, how it is constructed as a political entity, and I'll tell you what forms your epidemics and your measures to confront them will take. That's a very interesting point because it brings out the danger of new injustices that will emerge in this crisis that simply reproduce with new force the old social and political discriminations. The danger, in other words, of scapegoating particular groups of people, ignoring the suffering of others. And to think about this special injustice, I want to introduce just one last theorist before I finish my talk, the political theorist from America, Nancy Fraser, who uniquely has written about this political dimension of justice, which is so often forgotten. The dimension of justice which tells us who is included in and who is excluded from the circle of those entitled to justice in the first place. Who do we think about when we think about who is getting a fair deal? Whose suffering do we never think about when we think about justice? Who's hidden in the shadows? And this underlying politics at the deepest level of who is included and excluded from our view when we think about political justice is itself a level of injustice that we have to remember, especially at times of crisis, when resources are so scarce, when fear is so high. And journalists, I think, have a special responsibility to be alert to this deep form of injustice and to confront it. Why? Because journalists have the special capability to do this. Journalists, after all, have more access to facts than most people in society. They can choose the diversity of voices they represent, and it's really vital that they spot any injustices in terms of who is being heard and who isn't. So let me just sum up. What is happening today, right across the world, is that the coronavirus is literally shaking society apart. It's shaking apart existing social orders. And in the course of that, there's no doubt that new social orders are being built, whether they're going to be good or whether they're bad. And we will find out before long. We don't know it yet. In this situation, journalism's role, summing up what I've said so far, is to exercise as well as it can its special, unique role as society's institution everywhere for circulating information, representing voices, and confronting injustice. Citizens, populations, humanity as a whole, whether they live in democracies or not, because that is not the question, need something like journalism, something like professional journalists to exercise those roles, because without strong journalistic institutions, societies are not only poorer, not only, as Amartya Sen says, less developed, they are less safe. But the question, the unanswered question I have to leave you with is, how do we sustain, how can we build those journalistic institutions today in an age of social media, when, as we know, social media and many other forces are damaging journalism's historic economic models? That's today one of society's great unanswered questions in democracies and elsewhere. And we urgently, I think, need to find the answers to that institutional question. So that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to all your fascinating questions. Thank you.